Hello, and welcome to Setting the Stage, Conversations in Performing Arts Health. My name is Brian McGoldrick. I'm currently a second-year PhD student in Performing Arts Health at the University of North Texas with a related field in research, measurement, and statistics. And today we are joined by an alumni of UNT and the center, Melissa Lewis. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Um, just as a brief introduction, and I'll let her introduce herself and her accolades. Melissa graduated from the University of North Texas in 2014 with a bachelor's in music education and recently completed a graduate certificate in public health from the UNT Health Science Center down in Fort Worth. She was heavily involved in marching band based research, and she is now the Director of Advanced and Instrumental Music Studies for the Denizen ISD, overseeing grades 5 through 12. So, Melissa, I'll let you take it from there and anything else you want to add.
Sure. So, like you said, I went to the University of North Texas. I got my bachelor's in music education there. And I actually became involved with the center and with research as an undergrad.
Mhm.
I took the honors based version of Dr. Chesky's, what was then called the Occupational Health for Musicians course. And I took it my very first semester when I was a freshman in college. And that really sparked an interest for me because I had just recently had a playing related injury myself as a senior in high school. So, like so many people who become interested in this field of research, I had a personal connection to the field and thought, why aren't more people talking about this? This is so connected to my own experience. Why don't I hear more about this? And so that's how I became involved with this center. So I was a part of the Honors College as well, which really encouraged independent research projects. So I did my first research project starting in about 2011. It was eventually published in the Medical Performing Arts Journal through the Performing Arts Medicine Association in 2013 when I was a junior. Since my graduation, I have been teaching all over the North Texas area. I taught 1 year of middle school and then moved on to high school and have been in my most recent position for about a little over 2 years now. Kind of concurrently at the same time, I was working on my graduate certificate in performing arts health, or not performing arts health, excuse me, public health, which allowed me to stay sort of peripherally involved with research, and have been able to do some professional development sessions and other convention clinics and talks and things like that to stay involved in the field.
Awesome. 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 It sounds, and we talked about this briefly before the interview, just kind of these melding of worlds when we come
Yeah.
to, people with strictly music backgrounds moving into the what most would consider more traditional academia when you get into like STEM topics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It does sound like you had a little bit of a um, I guess just like a situational impetus to get involved though with the honors college involvement. So that's super cool.
Yeah,
Uh,
it gave me a sort of launching point. They did a few undergraduate research sort of fairs,
mhm,
which I did first a poster presentation, which then turned into the literature study before the actual research project that I did at UNT.
mhm,
I worked with the UNT Green Brigade Marching Band. I
mhm,
was at the same time that I was doing research, I was also one of the student assistants. So I was teaching that group as sort of like a marching tech or an undergraduate assistant, which
mhm.
gave me the connections to then use that group as my study population.
Worked out well. Worked
Yeah,
out.
it did. It did.
Mhm,
So it's definitely been, like you said, an interesting melding of the two worlds. When I was doing my undergraduate research, I noticed that most of the people who were presenting research had very science-heavy backgrounds, as opposed to the perspective of the musician or the music educator,
mhm,
and that always, I wouldn't say bothered me, but I always wanted to see that more performing educator perspective in the research. So part
mhm.
of the reason why I got my graduate certificate in public health was so that I could understand their world, so that I could then speak with my perspective to their world.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because we can both speak to undergraduate experiences in music. The more empirical side, is probably a better word for that, but empirical side of research is not something that's explored super often. A lot of the research we're taught, even in, in master's programs for performance, certainly, is more based on research.
Qualitative.
Yeah. Like kind of more of a historical perspective or of an analytic perspective if we're looking at theory or something like that, but never really on like the traditional methodology or anything like that. But yeah, I was hoping first could talk a little bit about your experience with the TCPAH. You, unlike the vast majority of people involved with the center right now, got involved as an undergraduate student. So I was wondering if you could speak to that experience a
Yeah,
little bit.
sure. So like I said, I took the occupational health for musicians course my very first semester,
Mhm.
and it was one of the first semesters I think it was offered for undergrads, and I just became really interested in the topic. I was that person who would always kind of go off on tangents, like why aren't we talking about this in our music ed classes? Why aren't we talking about this topic and this topic?
Mhm.
And Dr. Chesky at the time said, you seem really interested in this. Let's have more conversations. Why don't you come sit in on my, intro graduate course? So I just started kind of auditing classes. I would go to the, intro level first year master's courses and just sit in and talk about, the literature that they were reading through or the different articles and participate in those conversations. And I was lucky enough that they allowed me to do that. And then from there, just decided to pursue it further by doing a poster. So I first did a poster that I presented at the UNT Scholars Day through the Honors College. And then after a couple of those, decided to expand it further into a paper. At the same time, the center was pretty actively involved in the Performing Arts Medicine Association. And I wrote a couple grants to get some money through the Honors College to attend that conference. So I went actually to that summer symposium every year for my entire undergrad, which just gave me that perspective and continued those conversations with high level researchers, which was
Mhm.
really cool as an undergrad. You kind of don't realize that it's a unique experience for an undergrad to be doing that until you're done with it.
Right.
But it was looking back, it's something that really shaped the course of my college experience. It was great.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I certainly did not do that as an undergraduate student. And
Yeah,
even as a,
I remember I don't know if you can use this in your video, but I remember my first symposium. I wasn't
Mhm.
even old enough to drink. I had just turned 20. And
Mhm.
so we're in Aspen, and part of what you do at conferences is have discussions over dinner and
Yep.
whatnot. And
Yep.
I was barely 20. So I was the DD for most of our our dinners out.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, that's definitely part of the culture for for one reason or another. And it doesn't even matter which discipline. It's,
Oh, music
music
educator
theory.
conferences they go hard.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so talking about some of the research that you did, particularly some of the stuff that you've published in the MPPA journal, in conjunction with PAMA and stuff like that. You've had a focus on more epidemiological focused works on the marching band population, which is something that, just to give a little bit of context for the audience, is still a fairly underexplored area. And I was wondering if you could talk about your experiences with researching that population and maybe not speculation, but discussion as to why it's still kind of slowly moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So I chose that as my research topic because at the same time I was in my undergrad, I worked every single fall and summer at local high school programs and eventually
Mhm.
for drum corps
Yep.
as a visual technician. So it was
Mhm.
my way of being able to combine both my passion in terms of the education side as well as that research emphasis. And
Mhm.
so that's why I chose that as my study group. Like I mentioned previously, I was working with the UNT marching band already as an undergraduate assistant. And so I was able to have pretty great access to that population to use them as my study group. Um, so it just sort of melded those two worlds for me. And it's interesting because, like you mentioned, it's still a very under researched group. And I liken it in many ways to where sports medicine was in terms of looking at football or other um, high school team sports, but about 10 or 15 years ago.
Mhm.
Marching band is the most visible part of any instrumental music program. We're the group that is performing at parades and football games. It is often the largest spirit student organization on a campus and can really encompass the culture of a school. So it makes sense for that group, I think, to be more researched because it's so forward facing, it's so public facing. But unfortunately, we're dragging a little bit. And the reason why I liken it to where sports medicine was, 10, 15 years ago, is because that's about where we are in terms of what we're researching. We know that there is a physical aspect to marching band. You know, we give physical education credit in almost every single state in the country.
Mhm.
So we understand that it's a physical activity. And we're starting to see through some of these epidemiologic studies that there is an impact on the student's body from participation, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. We know that there is some impact on the student, but we aren't quite yet to the point where we're able to say these are the resources that we need. These are the types of wellness education modules that we need for students. These are the sort of, pre-participation stretches that are showed to be the most effective in reducing injury. These are the types of, physical training that helps to reduce injury. We're not there yet. So I think over time, I hope over time, that you'll see more of that research that says, okay, we know that this is the type of injury that's resulting. Now here's what we can do about it to lower that risk. But we haven't quite made that jump yet. What I do think is interesting though is the drum corps world is starting to step up more in terms of providing resources. So drum corps, for those who aren't familiar, it's sort of like the collegiate or professional level of the marching band activity. It normally takes place over the summer and involves students anywhere from age 14 to 21, but for the most part, it's college age participants. And when I first started doing research, there was a very young group called the Drum Corps Medical Project, which I was part of when fairly early on. I'm no longer a part of that group because it's now shifted focus to be more athletic trainer focused. They're now called the Drum Corps Health and Wellness Project, I believe. But what's cool about how that's changed over the years is that now it is fairly standard practice for these large drum corps to employ a full-time athletic trainer, someone who travels with their group of young people as they travel all over the country. And 5, 10 years ago, that was not the case. So you are starting to see more resources being provided in that genre of marching band. And hopefully we'll start to see those resources trickle down more to the secondary level school.
Mhm. It's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, when I was doing it back in 2010 and 11, I cannot, I couldn't tell you if there was a
Well,
personal,
it used
I
to be,
don't think there was.
and in so many ways, music education kind of had this attitude when I was in high school and even starting college that, you know, this isn't hard. If you're not in
Mhm.
pain, it couldn't possibly hurt. It's a clarinet. How could it possibly hurt you?
Mhm.
Just push through, practice more, go woodshed it out and play it in 10 times in a row until you can't play it wrong. That
Mhm.
was the world that we grew up in terms of music education. And now, especially as I've gone into the classroom and started working with students, um, you're starting to see more of a practice smart, practice efficiently model, as opposed to just play it until you can't play it wrong. Which
Mhm.
again, I think is hopefully going to be seen more and more as we start to look at that sports medicine model of peak performance. At what point do you start having diminishing returns? Um, you see that in sports medicine, and I try to apply it to my own classroom. At what point are we going backwards in terms of our playing efficiency? At what point are we no longer having a good practice session? We're just repping it over and over to rep it over and over.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's yeah, I guess this overarching theme of and I'm sure a lot of people, if not most people, would agree. If we are going to draw some kind of like athletic comparison between music performance and traditional athletics, then marching band would be
The most
seemingly,
obvious parallel.
yeah, yeah,
Well, and I always say that musicians, we're fine motor skill athletes.
hmm
We're not using the large muscle groups necessarily of, your upper extremities, but there are fine motor skills that you're doing thousands of times in any given performance or music class. And
hmm
it does have that obvious parallel to marching band, just because especially now, the activity is so different. There's dance, there's all this choreography element. So it really, especially as the activity has evolved, it's almost more similar to Cirque du Soleil in terms of the different dance and gymnastic type elements that are being involved in the activity. So it
hmm
just gives you a lot of room to look at different types of movement, and especially how it relates then to playing an instrument while doing all those crazy things.
hmm Yeah, and with regards to your research, um, what um, what were some of the, I guess, the dependent variables or some of the issues that you were looking at? Was there a focus, or was it kind of a broader epidemiological effort?
Started very broad,
Mhm.
probably because I was an undergrad who had no basis in study design. So
Mhm.
it started very broad.
Right.
But the more that I looked into the data, and there were, I mean, thousands of, oh, it was in hindsight, I needed to narrow my focus from the get-go. But
Mhm.
the longer it went on, the more I started to look at the differences between non-music majors and music majors.
Mhm.
Because the UNT Green Brigade Marching Band was an interesting group in that it was fairly evenly split between music majors and non-music majors.
Mhm.
In most other large university marching bands, it tends to be mostly non-majors.
Mhm.
But since UNT is such a big music school, it had a very sizable portion of music majors who had to be in the marching band for 2 to 3 semesters. So we were able then to look at those two populations of non-music majors versus music majors and look at the differences between the two. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the music majors reported much higher levels of reported pain,
Mhm.
or other symptoms of musculoskeletal injury than your non-music majors, which for anyone who is involved in music as an undergrad or at any point, post-secondary, makes sense because you're playing all of these hours not only for marching band but for your concert band class, for your applied classes, for your private lessons. But it sort of reinforced a lot of things that we already knew anecdotally but had never before actually had research to say, yes, this verifies what we thought.
Mhm. Yeah, no, and that's a I think it's a super interesting connection when we talk about like the somewhat a need for clarification when it comes to empirically looking at certain activities, particularly marching band, but various other activities in the music or music performance medium. And we've held these kind of colloquial anecdotal beliefs, as you put them, just like, oh well, this might be difficult, but then it's countered by other anecdotal colloquial beliefs from another perspective, say more purely athletics. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
this isn't so bad. But then when you put the more that empirical lens on it, you could say, oh, this is an issue.
Yeah,
It's super.
absolutely. And there were a few surprises. I remember one of them, we looked at the different sections of the group. So looking at your woodwinds versus brass, percussion, color guard. And I remember being surprised that the group that had the most number of individual pain sites was the color guard. Because again, anecdotally, just within the marching band, you can think to yourself, well, they're not carrying anything. They're not, they're just spinning. What is so difficult about that? But then when you have that empirical lens and look at the data, you start to make those connections like, oh, okay, well, this makes sense. They're really more of a dancer. And then you can start looking at the dance research and you can make more connections that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. So before we started the interview, we were talking a little bit about kind of this educator perspective, or like this educator lens. And we kind of talked about how a lot of the people that are involved in the study of occupational health and the performing arts and performing arts health, or the various other names for it, um, have either a performance background, a strictly medical or healthcare background, or some amalgamation of the two. And it seems like marching band in particular, just because of its um, its status as a group activity, but one that doesn't, not that it's that this is a bad thing, but isn't linked as clearly as, say, as like, a traditional concert band to your like applied lessons, right? Marching band, at
Mm-hmm.
least to me, in my experience, was its own entity.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that in mind, what about that makes the educator perspective more vital, or increasingly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, from my very first experience with, that first occupational health for musicians class, I was always stuck on the point of why haven't I heard about this before now?
Mhm,
Why was this not talked about when I was in sixth grade clarinet class? Why was this not talked about in my high school band?
mhm,
And I think it's because up until this point, the people having these types of conversations that we're having now, they don't happen in the teacher, music education undergrad courses. These kinds of conversations don't happen at the Texas Music Educators Association. They're happening with people who are more scientifically driven or looking more at the research side or going into the medical side. So you're getting more of that, again, reactionary approach to, oh, I'm seeing a patient who has this injury, let's figure out why, versus the teacher who probably has seen incorrect hand position for months, but
mhm,
didn't realize that it could also lead to a potential injury down the line.
mhm,
And from the very get-go, that has been my interest is how can we fix this in the classroom? And I probably am misremembering Dr. Chesky's favorite metaphor about the river. But what I took away from that lecture, which I think I saw every semester, was that the sooner you the sooner you're in that sort of line of questioning, the sooner that you can interrupt, the incorrect hand position or all those sort of behaviors that could lead to injury,
mhm.
um, sort of the better off. That's what I took away from it. So, especially as it comes to marching band, I think that educator perspective is so important. Uh, Again, because you're giving PE credit. One of the papers that I wrote after I graduated my undergrad was looking at the certification standards for music educators versus physical education teachers,
Mhm,
because marching band gives PE credit, but I'm not certified to teach PE. And most of my students, the only time that they take a physical education class is when they take my marching band class.
mhm,
They're excused from taking another PE class because they're taking mine. And so, for a lot of our students, this is the only time that they're getting those health teaks is in our
mhm,
classes. So I think we have even more of a responsibility to our kids to make sure that we're teaching marching band in a healthy and sustainable way, because for many of them, that's their only time that they're getting that information.
mhm.
And that's true for quite a few. I can't remember the percentage, but I think it was like 36 states, if I remember correctly. Marching band is a replacement course for other physical education courses.
Mhm.
So, really, just the entire time I've been involved in research, whether it be looking at marching band lens or just more of a um, wellness education lens in music classes. That's always been my interest, is what can I do from the podium? What can I do at the front of my class to make sure that my kids aren't experiencing injuries down the line? Or perhaps even more importantly, how can I identify those kids that are experiencing injury? And
Mhm.
in the 7 years that I've been teaching, I've seen kids with ganglion 6. I've seen kids with TMJ, kids with tendonitis, all high school aged or younger. So you do see these injuries at young ages. It's just whether or not you can see them in the ensemble setting. And I think one of the benefits of being involved with this undergraduate research and with this center was that it opened my eyes to what these possible musculoskeletal injuries could be, and
Mhm.
just heightened my awareness of them. Um, in many senses, I think of myself more as a coach, especially in marching band, but still in concert band as well. I think of myself as a coach of fine motor skill athletes, because that's what musicians are. We're doing a very fine motor skill movement over and over and over again, hundreds of times. And we
Mhm.
have to take care of our students as if they were those athletes.
Mhm. Yeah, and um, it's a really interesting parallel to be drawn. I'm not sure if you were, I believe this was for Denton ISD exclusively, but last academic year, so fall of 2019, um, there was an outreach effort and kind of
Mhm.
a professional development day for music, just general arts educators in Denton ISD.
I
And
think Megan Taylor, the one leading that. I think I had
yes,
conversations with her leading up to that. Yeah.
yes. And it was, among the many concerns and among the many comments that came out, one of them very much in line with your comment about kind of the discrepancy between the taught competencies of PE versus music ed. It's just, yeah, where do I get this training, right? Like,
Well,
um,
how do I get the here's what you can do to prevent it, as opposed to here's which doctor to refer them to when they get that?
right,
Which I
right.
think what we see more and where the research is now is okay, well, your kid has this injury, here's who to refer them to, as opposed to
Mhm.
what can I do proactively in my classroom? How can I structure my lesson so that I'm not having, such a sound intense, potentially dangerous level of sound exposure in a class,
Mhm.
or a potentially dangerous amount of the same kind of movement, same kind of technique being woodshedded over and over and over again in a
Mhm.
class. And I think again it comes back to there's unfortunately not a lot of prevention research happening right now,
Mhm.
which I hope that we'll see more of. And because I think when you see more educators get involved in this area of research, that's when you'll see the prevention start to come out. And I've
Mhm.
done a few over the years since I've been teaching. I've done a few professional development sessions as well, talking about specifically related to marching band, what are different physical training regimens that we can do, what muscle groups should we be focusing on,
Mhm.
how should we begin teaching certain techniques, like, when you look at a marching slide, for example, the traditional way of teaching that is by starting with a full 90-degree slide, where your
Mhm.
toes are facing direction of travel, but your upper body is rotated around to be facing the audience. Well, from what I've learned with the performing arts medicine, that anything more than 15, 20 degrees away from neutral is a potentially dangerous posture that you don't want to spend a lot of time in. And here we
Mhm.
are traditionally teaching a literal 90-degree slide.
Mhm.
Is that really the best way to teach that particular technique? Could
Mhm.
we instead start by teaching it at a 45-degree angle rather than 90 and still get the same kind of concept taught without keeping them in that potentially dangerous posture?
Mhm.
Those are the kind of things that I have explored in previous professional development. I've been lucky enough to present at the Texas Bandmasters Association, Texas Music Educators Association, and also when I worked in Frisco ISD, I did a few teacher in-service trainings there as well. Just starting to provide hopefully more of those preventative type measures, ways to adjust your teaching rather than just reacting to the injuries that invariably will crop up.
Hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, the notion of, well, yeah, preventative um, measures and being, I guess that kind of ties into I would presume, and granted, I don't have a background in music education, but just this overall mindset of, yeah, what can I do from this perspective, right? Like,
Yeah,
how can I
absolutely.
be proactive from this level?
Well, and so much of it actually does tie into what you already learn in music education in terms of correct hand position. It's very easy, I think, to layer on top of that correct instrument carriage and hand positioning the musculoskeletal side of it. We tell kids that, for example, when playing the euphonium, that you want their finger to come directly down on top of the valve cap, both
Mhm.
because if they come this way, then you end up getting that's how you get sticky valves. But also from this ergonomic standpoint, if you're someone who's hypermobile, if you're pressing down the valve here, if I'm hypermobile in my first joint, I can hyperextend here, versus if I come straight down, which what we already know to be correct hand position, I'm not going to hyperextend that joint because it's set up to take that load a little bit better. So it's already, I think, like it's very easy, I think, to layer on that musculoskeletal or ergonomic lens.
Mhm.
We just unfortunately haven't had that connection made, but I think it's there. And I get oddly passionate about this topic because I just love this idea of layering this ergonomic lens on top of music ed to make those parallels. I just get really excited about it.
No, absolutely. And I mean, suffice to say, it's one that's, I would say, is missing. Well, it's interesting. It almost seems like it's popping up more in light of COVID. Having some of these more like ergonomic approaches to, how do we continue doing this, right?
Yeah, well, and it's forcing us to be innovative.
Hmm.
If you are limited to the amount of time that you can have in-person instruction,
Hmm.
you're having to be more efficient in what you do. And I'm very lucky in the position that I'm in now, that I'm not only able to design the COVID responses for our instrumental music classes,
Hmm.
but I've also played a very big part in developing the curriculum for grades 5 through 12. So we're able to sort of layer in those uh, wellness education ideas throughout the curriculum, which has been really nice.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, and that's really interesting that that you've been in charge of the
Well, in terms of the music education
yeah.
side, so looking at for COVID specifically, looking at the distance between the chairs, the different types of bell covers, uh,
I see. Okay.
different
Okay.
playing masks, um, specifically just how it relates to the instrumental side of things. And I
Hmm.
think, in some ways, COVID has brought a new focus to performing arts medicine because everyone was so anxious to hear the results from that Colorado study of how can
Right.
we do this safely, what kind of bell cover, what kind of fabric, what kind of playing mask, how can we do this safely. So I think it's brought a spotlight kind of to this area of research that many people before the summer probably didn't even know existed.
Right. Right. No, and that is interesting. It was it was almost a watershed moment for the field, where you have, suddenly all this attention on it. And I remember seeing almost like virtually all of my colleagues from my performance days like focusing in on this one study. And it was,
Yes,
part of
yes.
me was like, oh, this is awesome. This is great that everybody's getting involved. But on the other hand, just like, I wish y'all could be involved
Right.
most of the
Well,
time.
and
Yeah.
hopefully, hopefully the knowledge that field even exists, hopefully we're able to build upon that going forward.
Hmm.
I can say probably the best thing that's come out of our COVID response is puppy pads. Like who knew? But using puppy pads to collect the condensation from instruments has been life changing in my middle school,
Interesting.
and that's never going away. Um,
Yeah.
so hopefully people are taking more away from that study than just puppy pads. Um,
Right.
but speaking of someone who's in the classroom, that has been a game changer.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, and that's, I mean, certainly a perspective that's missing from us right now, at least in terms of research. We can't go out, but of course, it's been at the back of our minds, like how how is this explicitly affecting, uh, I guess, parts of our stakeholder population, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and what's going to be interesting to see is we have a population of beginners, students who are starting their music education via Zoom.
mhm,
In many places that have been virtual only,
mhm,
or even in my school district, which has the majority of students in person, there are still that cohort of kids who are virtual only or who will
mhm,
go into quarantine for 2 weeks. So you have beginners who um, you've never seen in person holding their instrument. You've only seen them through a screen. And so we already know in the music education world that there is going to be a lot of catching up to do in terms of their tone production, but also the ergonomics of how they're holding their instrument. Because if you're not
mhm,
seeing them in person, there's going to be all sorts of shenanigans going on with how they're holding the instrument. And there's going to be some long-term impacts on that, which I think will be interesting to track over the years.
mhm. No, absolutely. Um, and that's, yeah, I'm hoping some research comes out of that line of thought.
The one
Um,
thing I miss probably the most in my current job, I'm not able to do as much research as I would like to.
sure.
I
Yeah.
still have this like notepad with tens of, not hundreds, but tens of
Mhm.
research ideas, which one day I'll get to. But I think
Right.
that's probably what I missed the most. Because all throughout my undergrad, I was doing music ed and research concurrently. Um,
Mhm.
you know, but since I've started teaching, I just haven't had as much time for it as I would like, unfortunately, because I think that perspective of someone who is in the classroom would be really beneficial to the research discourse.
Mhm. No, absolutely. Um, I'm gonna mark a cutoff here. Um, I think we've covered some really great um, topics so far. Is there anything that you would like to? Again, this doesn't need to be a super long interview. This is really as
Yeah,
long as you want. Are there any topics that you're still wanting to kind of touch on, or you
I
would
think
like to talk?
I think we probably covered the main. I mean, my main takeaway really truly is the preventative side. What can you do from the moment the student begins to learn the instrument? What can you watch for from the podium that will not only react to the inevitable injuries that come up, but also um, prevent them? And it's not to say that playing a musical instrument or participating in marching band is a dangerous activity, because I don't think it is, but it's a physical
Mm,
activity. And with any physical activity, there's an impact on your body.
mhm,
And just like coaches have learned over the years, these are the types of pre-activity stretches we can do. These are the cool down stretches. These are the ways that we can train in the off season to make our students as prepared for that activity as possible. I think that music educators need to have the same kind of conversations. And I
mhm,
think that there is a great need for that kind of research,
mhm,
because the parallels to sports medicine are there. We need to do the research to have the data to back it up.
mhm,
And it's by having that data that we're able to get more resources. One of the things that people always got really jealous of at my last school, I had a really great relationship with the athletic trainer. And
mhm,
I was the only school, the only marching band in the district who had full-time student athletic trainers come to all of my marching band rehearsals, all of my football games, and all of my marching band contests.
mhm,
And we needed their help. We had them, wrap ankles or do KT tape, or, we were able to, even at my school now, have the head athletic trainer on speed dial if we had an issue with overheating or anything like that during summer band. And it was beneficial to our students because they were able to get those resources. But it was also beneficial to us as the teacher in the podium to not have to try to put on the nurse's hat, and when really what we're trained to be is the teacher. So again, by doing this research, we were able to get those resources which were beneficial to us as the teacher and also to our students.
mhm.
And that's what I hope to see, across the secondary area.
Yeah. No, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah, this is just based off super informal lit review on my part. But one of our last assignments for the musculoskeletal health class, and of course, I was taking it in the semester where COVID had
Mhm.
interrupted, so that made it kind of a last project difficult. But we were looking basically for gaps in the literature, and that was more or less our assignment. And I ended up looking at exercise regimens directed towards musicians, and it was really interesting. Just like there isn't a lot, and it just the populations that are looked at are so varied,
Mhm.
in their composition, in in their demographic information.
Well, and you
In
don't see a lot of school age populations because it's hard to do
no,
research on school age kids.
no, yeah, it was almost exclusively on adults,
Mhm.
on professional musicians or collegiate musicians. And as a result, the sample sizes were all, I think, smaller than we would want them to be.
Right.
But yeah, I thought that was particular.
No, that's a really good point because, just looking at again marching band, which is my kind of area, the way that we do preseason training for marching band is so different, and honestly it's based kind of anecdotally off whatever workout routine the band director's done most recently. One
Mhm,
school may do CrossFit, one school may do Pilates, one school may just run for
mhm,
45 minutes. And it's
mhm.
not because there's any data saying this is what's proven to be most effective. It's just, whatever
Right,
whatever workout DVD they got for Christmas that previous.
right,
Um,
right.
so it's definitely a big gap in the research. And again, it
Mhm,
comes back to that preventative. What can we do to prevent injury rather than just reacting to it after it happens?
mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, all right, cool. I'm trying to
Yeah.
think if there's any other questions, and then obviously this part will be cut out. Talked about research. Won't talk about. I mean, would you like to talk about the Brenner stuff, or are you okay with? Nah.
Okay.
Okay, cool. That was something that Chesky brought up, but he
So,
can he
well,
can
if
live
he mentioned it, I can briefly talk about it.
only if you want. Only if you want.
No, sure. So, kind of the end result of the research that I did as an undergrad, I ended up submitting it to the Performing Arts Medicine Association, their big research competition every year,
Mhm,
which is named after one of the founders, Alice Brinfenbrenner.
mhm,
And when I won it in 2013, um, it was a very big surprise to me because up until that point, only MD students had ever won the award. So I was the first, not only undergrad, but also the first music, let alone music education content area person to win that award. And it was a really great experience. It was my first time doing, a big study presentation. I gave the keynote presentation in 2013. And I remember thinking to myself afterwards, well, that wasn't that bad. I mean, I basically just taught a lesson. Because when you get right down to it, when you teach a group of kids, it's, it's the same as presenting research to a bunch of doctors. You're just teaching
mhm.
a lesson.
Yeah.
And that to me was a kind of a big watershed moment because it made me realize how much I like actually presenting research. Because in the end, it's just teaching a class.
Right.
And so that made me apply to more presentations and start to give more talks after I graduated because it just sort of opened that door for me. So it was
Mhm,
it was a great experience. Um, yeah, definitely a unique one to be. I think I
mhm,
was 20 when I won, so I was really young, but it was a great experience.
mhm. Yeah, and I think certainly kind of has helped the interdisciplinary aspect of this, right? When we talk
Mhm.
about like the purely healthcare driven perspective, and
Absolutely.
and
Yeah, and I remember when right after I graduated, I actually the summer after I graduated, I was a student assistant for Dr. Chesky, and it was
mhm,
right when Dr. Survey had started to um,
mhm,
come to start to have that sort of collaborative approach. And I remember sitting in Dr. Chesky's office and starting to have a lot of those I was just a fly on the wall while he and, Dr. Survey were having these conversations about what they could do collaboratively. And, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have the Health Science Center work with the College of Music? And so it was a really cool time to be sort of that fly on the wall, taking notes in the background while they were planning out what I think eventually became the doctoral program that we're in right now. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a very cool time to be involved with the center and sort of the eventual direction that it took.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we've come to the end of our interview today. Want to thank you, Melissa, for stopping by and talking to us and offering your perspective. Certainly a unique and important perspective on what we do here and what can be done, what should be done. If you're interested in more interviews like this, you can find the rest of them on the Setting the Stage banner or page on the Texas Center for Performing Arts Health website, which is affiliated with the University of North Texas. So again, my name is Brian McGoldrick. We've been interviewing Melissa Lewis, and thank you for watching.